Our approach when we are doing DEI programming is twofold. This is a very new field and this is new for companies to implement. But what I've seen in companies is that they really focus on the education piece. And that's great. There should always be an education piece, but there's not a support piece. And that's why our programming includes both. So what we do is we go into a space, we figure out what people don't know, and then we help them be educated on those things. But then we also offer the support to the people that already knew those things, right?
Mm.
So there's a sort of gulf between us treating everything like it's entry level, and that is a perspective or a worldview from a person that is not marginalized. So teach me everything, I don't know everything, which is what a lot of DEI programs do. Come into the space, teach us what all these things are, and allow us to figure it out. What about the people that knew those things and are being harmed by those things and there's no support? So our approach is to do both, to provide the education and to provide the support so that the collective consciousness can really raise, so that the supported people can support the learning, and so that the learning people can support the people that need the support. It's just one of those things that I haven't seen as much as I'd like. And I'm not trying to compare us to anybody else or say that we're better, but I do think that we have a really unique product that we focus on both of those things. A lot of DEI programming is about perspectives and it's about who you're talking to. And I find a lot of times, a lot of this work is directed at people that don't have the lived experience, which is great. They need the learning too. But we also need to support the people that have had the learning, but not the support. So it's both.
When you talk about supporting people who are living this experience, what does that look like?
That type of support looks like mentorship. That looks like opportunity, being given access to things that have been denied before. I read a great quote that said that marginalized people don't need classes, they need mentors. When we look at the demographics of who gets promoted, who gets different opportunities, it's definitely stratified by race, gender, all those things that we know that our country is just set up that way. The best way to support the people that have the knowledge is to elevate them, make sure that they have the mentorship that they need for their careers. I do not ask members of marginalized groups to lead this work, to do this work, unless they would like to. What unfortunately happens is a member of a marginalized community is expected to be the person that receives the harm. They're expected to be the whistleblower and they're expected to fix it. And that's too many roles for them to play. The way that we do DEI programming is we recognize the people that are receiving the harm and we give the support. Now, if they want to turn around and say, I want to lead this discussion or I want to bear my wounds so that everybody can learn, that's fine. But they're not required to do that. And so that's also very commonplace in a lot of DEI programming is that they want to pull on people from marginalized communities, teach us, teach us, teach us. And there's no support for them and there's no backup for them.
What about the role of affinity groups?
Affinity groups are really important and they have to be very meticulous. Affinity groups are groups of people that gather based on a commonality. So it could be a group for women, a group for people of color, a group for members of the LGBTQIA community. It can be any of those things. They can have a group together. So it's basically around a commonality or a common interest. And the importance of affinity groups is really the support factor that we talked about. Support is needed for groups so that they can gather together and we can all talk about this from our lens, what even that lens is going to be different, right? It's important to be able to have a big group with everybody and a smaller group with the people that you share commonality with so that you can work out some of the things that maybe you don't understand, or maybe if someone's at a different place in their journey than you are. A lot of people have issues with affinity groups because it feels like segregation. It feels like we're saying whites only. It feels like we're dividing people by race and it feels uncomfortable. The discomfort is because the separation for so long has been negative. We're not using that larger group space as a place to place our questions that we could have had answered when we gathered together. Affinity groups are really important so that people can feel the support of the people around them and they can learn in a different way from their peers who share a commonality. And it's only uncomfortable in the beginning. Usually it gets a little bit better, but affinity groups are really important. They really contribute to the support of employees.
Yeah, one of those, there was definitely a huge element of like, oh, this feels kind of uncomfortable, but it was worth it, 100%.
The pushback is usually the first affinity group we always do is white and people of color. And even that has a lot of nuance, right? Because all people of color have different experiences. I, as a Black woman raised in America, have a very different experience than an Asian woman who was raised abroad and moved here. So there's a lot of layering to that also. We start with race because race is the easiest thing to identify. And it can be very difficult in the beginning, but it's really worth it. And those conversations really go a long way. When people of color gather together, there's a lot of things that have nothing to do with the larger group and that would distract from the larger group because they're not an issue. For instance, colorism is something that happens within communities of color. And so to discuss that with a larger group, it would just be confusing. And so there's just certain things that need to be discussed in smaller groups that can benefit the larger group in the end.
What would you say are the things that make you think this organization is moving in the right direction, they're achieving their goals, actually are making a positive impact here?
In order to judge success in the DEI realm, we cannot use the scales that we would judge success in any other realm. Judging how well it's working, I would say, by asking the people that are the most marginalized, by drawing from data that is from people who normally would have the worst experience. How do they think it's going? And also, another way to judge how it's going is how does the company handle conflict? How does the company handle when they are told something is not right? How does the company handle when they are brought things that are happening that are not great? I think a company that has really good equity policies and procedures in place has very humble leadership that says that we know that we're going to miss it sometimes, but we have created an atmosphere that complaints, that reports can be made easily, and that people do not feel retaliated against if they made a complaint or they brought something to the top. So I would say a successful organization is one that handles the change and that handles the nuance of this moment to moment and does not discourage people from being in leadership that may have the lived experience to help out. If someone has been harmed and they have firsthand knowledge on how to avoid this happening again, if they want to help, let them help. If they don't have to. A successful company in this regard is a company that is humble enough to know that we are still trying, that we have not figured it out, and that when something arises, we are not shocked and we don't go and hide our heads. We figure it out and we go head on. I think another way to tell if a company is really taking this seriously is how the leadership feels about it. If they're engaged, if they're asking questions, if they're willing to say, this is something that I unlearned and realized that wasn't right, and now I'm doing something else. I think it flows down. It centers on how we handle problematic employees. If an employee is brought to the attention of leadership or HR that they are problematic or that they use certain language or they're constantly using microaggressions, how does the company handle that? Who do they listen to? How do pay raises work? Who gets promoted? So there's a lot of ways to judge the data, but I would say for the most, it's about how the people feel at work. And you can get that by basically just asking.
You have to have a high degree of confidence and security to answer that question truthfully.
That's why we have to have equity standards, right? If I say how I really feel, will I be retaliated against? And if that's the atmosphere that you've created, then you're not going to get the data point. That's a good point. It works hand in hand. I think pulse surveys work in the same way that if there's no equity, you're not going to have a good data point. So if people don't feel safe enough to tell you the truth, you're not going to make any progress. I think that there's a lot of ways to make pulse surveys anonymous. But if you work in an organization when there's one woman and 90 men, you're going to know who's talking about what. So there's a lot of ways to hide that data, but it's also about how you present the data. I've done this in situations and scenarios where we've had to really, really boil it down to extreme highlights to not make anybody vulnerable. And that takes a lot of nuance also. It's how you present the data to the leadership so that it's workable, so that there's something to actually come out of it and that we can work on. Pulse surveys, as a person who has done them and been involved in them, I have had times where I answered completely honestly, and I have had times where I have not, because I know that I'm the only Black person on this team, and they're going to know that I'm the one that's saying these things are crazy. It depends on the equity of the environment. How comfortable are your employees telling you that you're not doing a good job on something? And what happens when they do tell you the truth? How do you handle it? How do you move forward? How do you make some action items out of it? Pulse surveys are very effective if the equity is in place.
People are building these companies, they're building these organizations. They hire 50 people and then they're okay, we've got to work on the HR DEI side of it.
I would say that's what 90% of companies are doing. Most people do not see a value in this until they have some more diversity and they realize that they need some policies in place. So if your hiring practice has always been you hire the same type of person or same type of demographic, these are not issues for you because everybody's the same. So when we start to see the job market start to change, and it's really going to change, there's going to be a lot more diversity in these job pools. And companies are going to have to start working from where they are. And most of it is working backwards because they haven't had to do this before. So we're lucky to be able to work with startup companies who are expecting us to help them with their foundational principles. But I'd say most companies are working backwards. And then working backwards is still okay as long as it's getting done and you're trying. But if you don't have to do something, you're not going to do it.
How do you get a baseline? Like, how do you figure out what type of a company you're going into? All companies have handbooks. They all say, treat everyone equal. Everything's fine here.
What I always encourage people to do in interviews is to ask the specific question, what is your company doing for your DEI engagement? And you can tell a lot about what a company's answer is. If it's, oh, we think everything's fine, or we have this policy over here. And if it's not really nuanced or they don't seem very interested, that's a big red flag, quite frankly, to say to anybody, not just a woman or a person of color or a person with a different disability status. It's for everybody. What is your company doing? What am I going to learn from you guys that I haven't learned somewhere else? And that's an important question to ask. Another thing that we always tell our candidates is that we have to pay attention to how the people who are perceived to have the least amount of power, how they are treated in the process. So if you're a candidate, there's a lot you can observe about maybe the administrative staff, maybe about the person that welcomes you in or gets you a glass of water. How are they treated? How do they seem? Just paying attention to the dynamics of the people around you can tell a lot about a company's culture. And also, how do they react when you stand your ground and ask for more? There's a lot of ways to tell what kind of culture a company has, but it's very difficult, to be honest. It's hard because you don't always know.
Culture fit versus culture add. Building a culture and everyone looks the same, acts the same, and you're hiring everyone you're going to want to go get a beer with. Where do you end up? Want to walk through culture fit versus
Yeah, definitely. We see a lot of companies that are hiring, especially small companies. They want to be able to work with people that they can be friendly with. That's not bad in nature. And so you always hear this term thrown around that we want candidates that are going to fit into our culture. We want people that we can work with. And so in theory, that's okay. When we talk about culture fit, that's really a dog whistle because what we're talking about is we want somebody like us. And if somebody like us is all four of us are the same, we're not really looking for a diverse candidate pool. So we really should shift our understanding to a culture add, which is someone can bring something different to the table, someone that we can nurture and support because it's going to be hard for that person to come into a situation where everybody is similar and they're the oddball out. Shifting the perspective from finding someone that can fit in with us to finding someone that can add to us is something that we really try to work with our clients on because this really opens the door for more diversity of thought, more diversity in education. I know specifically in biotech, a lot of companies like to hire scientists from a certain lab or from a certain school. And that can really eliminate a lot of people who can do the job and who can bring something new to the table and who also deserve the opportunity. So there's a lot of things to consider, but fit is something we want to avoid because what we're saying is we want someone like us. And cultural addition is saying we recognize that we have something that can be added to, and we are open to it looking a little bit differently than what we have here. We should really keep an eye on cultural additions so that they do not become tokenism either, because we can say, I want a Black person for this role. Okay, is that person going to go through their entire life at this company as the Black person? You have to be very intentional about it, but cultural additions come with the mindset that we are open to this looking differently, and we're going to make sure that we support these people coming in who are additions, and we don't ostracize them or tokenize them or make them the show pony.
Jen, thank you so much for your time. This was a really enlightening intro to DEI. If you've missed any of the 3 parts of this interview, please visit this playlist. And please hit like and subscribe if you found this content useful so we can continue to bring great career and professional development content your way.